Okay, so I think I think now that we're all settled, I think we'll kick it off. So today we're here to share the findings from the connection meter that we sent out about 2 weeks ago. Essentially, we've sent it out to a global audience. We've got feedback from different regions throughout the world, but also we looked at different demographics throughout the world. So I don't want to get sort of bogged down with the data and the stats, because after this, we'll actually send you out the report and you can have a look at that in your own detail. But certainly on this particular call, we've got a wealth of knowledge and a wealth of experience from people who actually represent the global community to where the survey has come about. The thing that I found really interesting is that with the connection meter, it found that 58% of people feel connected within the workplace, which is fantastic, which is great. The downside, it means that 42% of people aren't actually feeling connected. So it'd be worthwhile to investigate, this whole thing around connection and the findings from the report that identified connection as being aspects of collaboration, leadership, the practicality of working from home, and also stress. And it's really interesting to see that from a practicality perspective of working from home, that scored lowest by way of connection, but also to stress, I should say, but also to stress was also a key factor as well. So we can investigate all of those types of things. So the end result of this, we'll let this session go for half an hour, but how I like to run it is just to keep it conversational and interactive. So although people may have their microphones on, as strangely as it might be, I'm actually going to get you to turn your microphones, your microphones are currently off. I'm going to get you to turn your microphones on as if we're just having a cafe conversation in regards to that, and then we can just choose information. From the survey itself, what I found was a couple of key points before we get into our conversation, and found was we're really at this tipping edge of the 58%, 42%. And what I got out of this is leaders are actually doing the right thing. So leaders are doing the right thing. However, they need to have more flexibility around the concerns of people, particularly in regards to creating collaborative workspaces. And the other thing that came out of the survey was that people aged 35 to 55 had the highest levels of stress when it came from working from home. And that's across the global community. And there's a number of factors for that. And also, it's likely that these pressures and these stresses are elevated due to either cultural complexities or expectations of others from the working environment to the home, where people might actually feel guilty working from home and not feeling productive. So one of the key findings is that leaders need to continue providing management support and be accessible to the team. But also, too, they need to be aware of the triggers when they're dealing with people operating from a home environment. And this ties into all the stresses. So again, I don't want to get bogged down in all the details and things like that. But what I'd be really interested in is to open up the floor of conversation to just simply ask, has anybody observed some really good techniques of how people have created engagement and connection within the workplace? So maybe I can ask Darren. I'll just ask you, Darren, have you seen any good examples of where people have consciously wanted to create connection?
From a workplace perspective, probably a little bit hard for me to answer, given the type of work that I do similar to yourself, as a coach.
Sure.
I think the general trend, and I think this will be a commonly held view across this meeting and many others happening over the last few weeks, is that people are very much more comfortable now looking and using technology. In fact, there has been some very high-profile businesses here in the UK who are paying exorbitant rates for buildings in central London, and they've actually come out and said they may well not ever go back to those buildings where people are more capable of working from home. The reason that they're recognizing that that's a possibility is because people are just so much more comfortable with using technology. It was a solution this video conferencing technology was a solution looking for a problem. And now it's found one. It's found a huge one. And people are just suddenly very much more capable of being a little bit more authentic. And over the last few weeks, I've run a number of training sessions from my home to clients globally. And the common consensus that I've had is that people feel that they are able to be more their real self whilst being at home. They accept that they might not have a perfect background. It might be a bit messy. They may have children, young children, sitting on their laps as they're, trying to juggle doing a training program whilst being a parent. So I think that there's a general acceptance that people are maybe more capable of being their truer selves and maybe dropping that corporate mask, which I think really helps build a little bit of vulnerable leadership, where people just feel a little bit more capable of being, for want of a better cliche, real.
Yeah, and Darren, that's I've observed the same thing. This whole thing about authenticity is coming through. And interesting, from one of our previous coffee breaks was identify that technology was actually one of the stresses because of the learning curve. Now that was 3 or 4 weeks ago. So, potentially over the last 3 or 4 weeks, the competence has actually increased. But also too, what came out of the survey was by way of collaboration, team collaboration was actually a lower score, but the use of technology was a higher score. So it's interesting that if you took out of the equation the use of technology by way of collaboration, team collaboration would actually be quite a weakness within some workplaces. And I'd be interested to find out what other people are observing. So maybe Hamida, if I could just ask you, you're in Singapore. What are you finding by way of collaboration in the workplace?
Yeah, I work for a university, right? And of late, there has been a lot of I wouldn't say complaint, but people are getting fatigued of team collaboration virtually. It's been like, almost like working longer hours because they're not quite used to working from home first, because we've got a big campus to work from, and most of them don't usually travel like much of you, or many of you, but so it's the first time. So we're getting a lot of people trying not to go on virtual meetings. Even if they do, as opposed to what Darren is saying, more authenticity coming, they're actually trying not to show their camera, to not have their camera on. Complete opposite. I mean, I find it really, really heartening to see everybody have, natural background where you are staying. But when you come to a virtual meeting in Singapore, at least in the context of where I work, everybody start changing their backgrounds, so to something else. So that's actually, to me, that's masking and almost not as authentic as what you want them to come through.
And I think about communication, Hamida. So if you think about the parcel of communication being, 100% of communication is 5% words, 35% tone of voice, and 65% body language. The importance of having cameras on really helps with that whole communication. And a trend that I'm finding is with government agencies here in Australia, there's more cameras turned off than in, say, private enterprise where there's more cameras turned on. So an event like this is that whole connection. I think that's a key message. A key message for that. I'm curious, Brian, I'm just going to ask you, because you deal with a lot of CFOs, chief financial officers. Brian, what are you finding in the finance world?
Yeah, thank you. I think, I agree. People were really inhibited before, especially to switch on their cameras. But as things progress, a lot more people are warming up to the idea, and it's becoming more personalized, which is a good thing. And it's very hard to speak to a name, in essence. Some people have got their logos and insignias and whatever up, but it gives a more personalized touch, and it's it is getting better. And I mean, you were talking about the stress levels of the I call the older generation, at 32 to 55, and the stresses about the technology. I think initially people are concerned about that they're not in their corporate suits and they're wearing their ties, and it gives the wrong image. But ultimately, it's changing now. I think the longer these things carry on, I think that ideology that you need to be corporate is changing.
Yeah, and again, I think it's coming down to that thing of an authentic leader or a leadership style really has benefits of connection. And interesting is one of the things that came out of the factor of leadership out of the survey is that people actually felt very supported by the leaders. So this is something that scored very high. But interesting is in regards to the relationship with the manager, that actually scored low. So leaders are actually giving support to people, but the one-on-one connection of the relationship is not there. And so this is, it's starting to get me thinking about stresses, empathy, passion, connection, because there's a lot that's happening in, say, the people's home environments, where maybe what they want is more of a conversation as opposed to a KPI or a project update in regards to that. Susan, I'd be interested in your insights. What's your experience, just by way of collaboration and leadership? What are you finding is working?
Well, it's interesting. I was doing some work with an electrical group, so largely engineering. And we actually decided to build some skill on empathy because they actually were saying they didn't know what to say back when they were talking to team members who were having troubles with their kids or, things like that, because a lot of them were either older engineers and their kids were grown or they didn't have kids. So I certainly think it's that sense of how to really tap into the issues of being the full-time at-home working parent is, as you homeschool, is not something that everybody is faced with. My kids are grown, so I'm not faced with that. But I'm talking to a lot of clients who are, as a coach and facilitator, and they're feeling quite a lot of stress.
Well, yeah, actually the survey reflects that. So it's going to be interesting when we send out the copy of the survey to everybody, that basically between the ages of 30 to 50 were the people that had the highest stress levels. And the reason for that is they just had more stuff happening in their, I'm going to call it the home life, probably younger with a mortgage, couple of kids, maybe people sharing 2 or 3 homes, all trying to work from home, including homeschooling. So in Australia, in Western Australia, where I'm located, the kids are going back to school this week. But I believe in Singapore, Hamida, I think they're still being homeschooled.
Yeah, and even after the circuit breaker is over, it's lifted that's going to be lifted on the 1st of June, and only a group of students who are face major exams are allowed to go back to schools, but the rest and also still be telecommuting, or if you can work from home. So until such time where the government says, okay, now everybody go back to school, we're not looking at it being open almost immediately.
Yeah. Interesting. And Darren, what's happening in not London? What's happening in the UK? What's happening in the UK? Are people back at school, or what's the going?
So schools will be open. There's a lot of debate at the moment. Different ages of school children will be going back. It's not really at the forefront of my mind because of my 3 children. My youngest is 20, so I've kind of been watching it with half an idea. We've had a partial restriction of lockdown lifted, but it's incredibly ambiguous and incredibly confusing for people. So can we go to work? Can we not go to work? I think there's a lot of people just wishing that the government would spoon feed every single one of their decisions. But the reality is it's just about being sensible. But it's a little bit ambiguous. We are allowed out. We are allowed to meet members of other families, but we must keep that social distancing, and only one person and one person from different households. How confusing is that? It's a little bit ambiguous at the moment, and I think that ambiguity drives concern, fear. What am I allowed to do? And of course, as with all cultures, there are people who abide by the rules, and there are people who don't.
Yeah. And it's interesting that fundamentally, I think people like security. but different personality types will deal better or worse with change. So some people will roll with the punches, and other people it's just the higher stress factors. And certainly that's what we're hearing is we're hearing that those people that are extroverts are wanting to get back out into the workplace and to socialize. Those people that are introverts are just loving the fact that they don't have to interact with anybody.
Because people want clarity during this time because it's so ambiguous. Policy changes almost by the day, right? I mean, you don't know what you basically can't plan. A lot of things that I've planned, it's not going to happen. So do we become reactive, or do we become still, trying to plan things out? So it's been really, really difficult just getting things done.
Yeah, and I suppose being certain that things are uncertain gives certainty. Maybe. I mean, it's a classic thing, isn't it?
That needs to go on a t-shirt.
Yeah, true. Michael, I just want to get your input. Sorry, I don't know what industry do you work in? We haven't actually met before.
Oh, right. Okay. In a nutshell, it's pretty much consulting in the area of education and training for transport and logistics.
Great.
So it's a bit of a mixed bag.
True. So I've noticed that transport and logistics is actually on a growth curve along with IT companies, because people are buying more online, but now it's having to be delivered home. Are you finding that industry is?
Well, I guess it depends which industry area you look at. I guess obviously, as you would all be well and truly aware of, aviation's just been absolutely, devastated sort of thing by all of this. And so that's one side of it. From a rail perspective, I guess with WA, just with the export of iron ore, so they just got to keep churning it out and sending it to port so that it goes out. So that's just a continual process, and it's a matter of just trying to keep all the cogs or the wheels turning sort of thing to keep everything moving along. So from that perspective, it's good. But as there's a lot of travel to get workers to and from where they need to go, there's a lot of logistical planning and a few hurdles in not being able to travel cross borders that organizations have to deal with. And from a maritime perspective, it's also a similar related issue in terms of what defines quarantine if you're at sea sort of thing. So, I mean, people will be sort of worried about potential crews on ship bringing infection into their country, but then the actual crews themselves on the ships are worried about, okay, well, where we're going, could we then potentially be infected sort of thing. So then dealing with that sort of complexity, been, pretty interesting. And I guess just to touch base back on what you mentioned regarding the panic buying, that's subsiding, and I can only speak from Australia's sort of Perth perspective. Yes, there's a bit of a backlog that people are working through, but then it's nowhere near as chaotic as it used to be. And so now when people are saying that, oh, well, they're going to be hiring left, right, and center, they sort of had an initial sort of buffering up to be able to deal with extended shifts and branching up from that perspective. But now it's going back to normal. Instead of overtime and instead of working weekends as well, they're now consolidating, going back to normal hours.
Interesting. Yeah. So I want to talk about the practicalities of working from home, because this is where one of the scores came in as a lower score, and it's what's classified as being in the red zone. So what was identified is people found it easy to work from home, yet by way of the connectedness to the organization, that rated lower. Yet what people found was there's a lot of distractions to what's happening in the home front in regards to the practicalities of working from home. So maybe I'll just ask input from Brenda, because you're involved with the property insurance industry. Is that correct?
Sorry, you just froze there, Greg. I didn't hear your question.
Okay, that's fine. So in regards to, do you find there's many distractions working from home? And is that impacting on your business?
Not so much. We've been an APAC agency for since 2008. So I've only started working for Property Insurance Plus for 18 months. So working from home has been quite good. I also don't have little kids, so COVID-19 hasn't affected me from that point of view immediately. But I have noticed a lot of the clients that I would normally go and see do struggle a little bit with trying to create a good balance, being able to give to the family, keeping the kids entertained, as well as doing what they have to with regard to their job and their roles with work.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, so that's good. So it's business for you, it's business as normal because there's not that many distractions.
Yeah, it's actually been really good for me because normally I'd be out on the road a lot, and it's been great to have some grounding time and just time to get organised in my life and just not have to be rushing all the time in traffic. And it's been, I love it.
That's great. Yep, yeah, owning it. That's good. And Jean-Alain, how are you finding it working from home? Do you find there's many distractions?
Yes, well, we call it distractions, and you were referring to stress earlier. I'm not finding the stress really from the workload or from the job itself, but the stress is about managing the many things we have to do. With confinement, for example, the maid doesn't come to work, the gardener doesn't come, kids are at home, you have to ensure schooling and so on. So I'm actually finding it quite difficult to manage all of this during a limited time. You know, it's like your tasks have multiplied, but you still only have 24 hours in a day.
Yes.
Yeah, so this is the big challenge. But besides that, on the work front, you were talking about collaboration earlier. If you allow me to just make a point there, what I found actually working from, in my case, is something pretty, in my company, we did not really do that before. So exceptional circumstances actually forced us to get organized in a very short amount of time. What I found was that it's worked very well. And I've actually decided I'm going to integrate work from home in the way we organize ourselves. But also, if you look at the way things are evolving in general, in the macro environment, there's stress because people are fearing for what's going to happen tomorrow. Obviously, economies have taken a big hit. A number of companies are talking about closure. If you look at the hospitality industry and so on, and there's a bit of a ripple effect. My business is also affected. I'm actually forecasting a drop in income and so on. And that adds to the stress. I'm coming across a number of people who are having sleepless nights thinking about what's going to happen. So, yes. And interestingly enough, well, that stress is also there in my company, as I said. But what I found is that the level of solidarity among the people, even when they're in different locations, has actually increased quite a lot. In very simple things, you know, I'm actually one person short who's on maternity leave, and it's my peak period going into July contract renewal. And among a smaller workforce, I see the level of solidarity much, much better than before. People do not hesitate to chip in for someone else if, for example, that person has to spend time doing homeschooling and so on, you know. And that for me has been a very big positive. But that's also, you know, in anticipation of the fact that if we do not double up our efforts, we might not be well positioned to face challenges that are lying ahead.
Well, thanks, Charmaine. And it's interesting that what you've just mentioned is reflected in the survey, that for those people that identified stress as either high or very high, the top 4 stress factors were around personal health, particularly with those people that were 55 to 64. They were what they perceived the greatest at risk. Family stresses also rated high, personal financial stresses rated high, but also concerns around the organizational financial stresses of people who they worked with was also there as well. So I think what you've just mentioned really typifies what the survey is. Now, I'm really conscious of time because our coffee break is almost up. It's just flown by so quickly in regards to that. I just want to talk a few minutes about where to from here and maybe some support resources. With the connection meter, we still have that license for another 2 weeks. So if there's any organizations out there that want to tap in and utilize the Connect meter for their team as a free of charge service, I'm looking for companies that want to volunteer to survey their team. And if you can get responses of up to 25 people, then that way it makes the information valid in regards to that. Now, the normal fee for that connection meter is $1,800, but because we already have that license, if there's any organizations that want to use that, just maybe put in the chat area that you're interested in that, and we can touch base with you later on. Also, after this, if anybody wants to catch up with a one-on-one coaching conversation, I'm more than happy to do that as well. And so it'd be good just to touch base with everybody one-on-one. So that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. So before we do sign off, is there any key questions that people may want to ask just before we sign off this break?
I had a question, but it's probably going to be for another one, Greg.
Sure, Robin.
I go back to work not next week, the week after. I
Yes.
go to work in an open plan office in Perth. I don't know how I'm going to join into these Zoom meetings if they continue when I go back to work. So I almost have to stop them because my workplace is not set up for Zoom meetings. There's no quiet space for that. So I think that's going to be interesting because I love the technology, but as of that time, I'm sure I'm going to have to almost stop using it because we don't have the space to use it in the office.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah.
Well, that was, I hadn't considered that until today, actually. How am I going to continue joining in meetings like this when there's phone calls happening behind me, people walking around me and that stuff happening? That's too distracting.
Yeah. Yeah, interesting. So maybe it's about having a conversation with your manager, just talking about flexible working arrangements and maybe coordinating or scheduling Zoom calls around, that sort of time frame.
Yeah.
Yeah, could be there.
I think I can foresee that there's going to be a lot of offices that they're going to make a room designated for Zoom meetings initially. That's the feedback I'm getting on that kind of issue also.
Yeah.
Where someone can book a time as if they were having a normal meeting and just have their meetings. I mean, it's interesting. It really is interesting times.
Well, it's good observation and maybe similar to what Darren said, that he can foresee that there's going to be many vacant offices over the next 12 months because people are going to realize that they don't need to have as much floor space because people over the last couple of months have just got so used to connecting remotely in a collaborative environment in regards to that. Okay, so if you're interested in utilizing the connection survey, just drop it in the chat line. If you want to catch up one-on-one with the coaching conversation, put that in the chat line. I just want to say thank you. And culturally, I'd like to say Terima kasih, Hamida, Terima kasih, merci beaucoup, Jean Alain, shukran. I'd like to say shesheni. And what else can I say? If that's about all.
Thank you.
So thanks for everybody coming online. I look forward to catching up with you another time.
Really enjoyed it.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Greg. Thanks, everyone.